Today we're going to be talking about camera settings and just the 3 things you need to know in about 5 minutes. So let's get started. So as far as camera settings, there's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And the first thing you need to know about these 3 things is that they all share one thing in common, and that's they all affect the way the light is going to look in your picture. So just keep that in mind going forward. So first up is aperture. Your aperture is essentially just the hole in the lens, and depending on how wide or small your aperture is, affects different parts of the photo. So the first thing that your aperture affects, as we said, always light. And the way this works is, let's say you're taking a picture and you're shooting with a fairly wide aperture. Well, what that's going to do, it's going to give you a wider opening, and so therefore more light is going to be able to come in. But if you're shooting with a smaller aperture, that's a smaller opening, and therefore less light is going to come in. So wider aperture, brighter photo; smaller aperture, darker photo. Are you following me so far? Because not only does your aperture affect your light, but it also affects your range of focus. So for instance, let's say you're taking a picture of something and you're shooting with a fairly small aperture. Well, in addition to giving you less light, what that's going to do, it's going to give you a deeper range of focus, making it so that you can get the foreground, the subject, and the background all in focus. But let's say you just want your subject to stand out a little bit more. Well, if you shoot with a wider aperture, what that's going to do, it's going to give you a shallower range of focus, so that you can blur the foreground and the background and just have your subject sharp and in focus. So essentially, shooting with a wide aperture is like portrait mode on your iPhone. Simple. So a wide aperture means more light, shallower range of focus; small aperture, less light, deeper range of focus. And the way you tell how big or how small your aperture is what they call f-stop. On your camera, it's going to look like F and then it's a number. And the rule is, the lower the number on the f-stop, the wider your aperture. And the higher the number on the f-stop, the smaller your aperture. Simple as that. And believe it or not, that's the most complicated of all these 3 things. So next up is shutter speed. Your shutter speed is basically just how fast your camera is taking the picture. And the main thing that this affects is your motion blur. So for instance, let's say you're taking a picture of like your kids or your dog, just something that has a lot of movement, and your picture ends up looking like this. Well, the reason why that is because your camera is taking the picture too slow. But if you speed up the shutter speed, it's going to make your camera take the picture faster. And that way you'll be able to really freeze all that movement in place. But as we said, all of these have to do with light. And the way your shutter speed affects your light is when your camera is taking a picture, the shutter opens and closes. And if the shutter speed is super fast, not a lot of light gets a chance to come in. But when you slow down the shutter speed, it takes the picture slower. So your shutter is going to open, let in all the light, and then close, and giving you a brighter photo. So a fast shutter speed lets in less light but freezes movement. Slow shutter speed, more light but blurs movement. Hopefully that makes sense. Because let's say you're using everything you've learned so far, but your picture is still too dark. Well, that's where your ISO comes in. Or some people call it ISO, but don't call it that. It's ISO. But what your ISO is, it's basically just your camera's sensitivity to the light that's already there. So it's kind of like when you first wake up and everything just seems super bright. Well, the reason why that is because your eyes are more sensitive to light. It's the same with your camera's ISO. So when you boost your camera's ISO up, you're just making it so that your camera has a higher sensitivity to the light that's already there. Seems easy, right? Well, not quite, because there's a catch. Because the higher you go up on your ISO, the more noise or grain your photo will have. So instead of it looking like this, it's gonna look like this. And that's what you don't want. I mean, unless you're going for like a vintage type vibe, then I guess it works. But for the most part, you wanna go as low on your ISO as you possibly can. So, aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Hopefully all of these made sense, and now you can use what you learned and get out there and start using your camera with ease. In manual mode. Don't be afraid of manual mode. It's fine. But that's it for me. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you learned something. If you did, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe. And I'll see you guys next time. Finger guns.